extraordinary part of the financial crisis. What I think listeners need to understand, and this is very hard for ordinary people to understand, is that tax havens are not just about tax evasion. They're also places where banks and hedge funds and what are called shadow banks operate. And they operate in places like Jersey and the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg because of the weak regulation they can achieve over there. In fact, in most cases, there's no regulation in these places, so they can get away with doing whatever they want. And this means that, if we talk about what happened in 2007, 2008, when the banks tripped up over collateralized debt obligations and the mortgage markets, one of the reasons why financial services authorities and other regulators hadn't realized what was going on was because a lot of these special financial instruments, the collateralized debt obligations, were actually prepared and issued offshore in Dublin, in Jersey, in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. And no one was actually regulating what was going on. In fact, very few people were aware of what was going on. So when it happened, it came as a surprise because they hadn't been assessing and understanding the risks that were building up in the banking sector. And that was because there's this kind of constant game of pass the parcel, from one regulator to another. The banks were hiding these things offshore in a shadow banking system, and the regulators were saying, well, that's not actually our area of jurisdiction, so we can't regulate there. And they were assuming that the people in Dublin were doing that, which they weren't.
That sounds like a kind of crisis of regulation again. Can you just flesh out a little bit what you mean by a shadow banking system? That sounds almost spooky.
Well, it is pretty spooky, to be honest. Look, the banks, over the course of the last few decades, have been using shadow banks. These are unregulated banks, typically offshore, for a lot of their activities. In fact, they account for a huge proportion of banking activities, and they like to do this offshore precisely because they're unregulated. And because they're unregulated, they are more profitable. So banks have been operating out of shadow banks. Technically, they're called structured investment vehicles, but because they can get away with in an unregulated environment, a very profitable and therefore attractive environment for them. They do it in the tax havens precisely because they don't have to pay tax on the extraordinary profits they gain from working in this shadow banking system. So you have a combination of tax avoidance, lax regulation. It's all very attractive to the banks, so they use tax havens extensively for this. And the British regulators, by and large, paid no attention to it whatsoever.
Now, I'm trying to find a little bit of something positive in here. I mean, many of these tax havens are actually British, that is to say, the old colonies, this kind of thing. Have they actually benefited the British economy in any way? Because those tax havens are British ex-British places. Well,
the story they spin, and Jersey is exactly what you say. It's a Crown dependency. It's been closely associated with the Crown since 1066, when the Duke of Normandy invaded Britain. And Jersey's very close to the City of London. Its financial centre is a satellite of the City of London. And what they boast is, well, we're actually really good for Britain because we pass hundreds of billions of capital from other countries through to the City of London. And that appears to be really good for the UK economy until you start thinking about how that money is invested. This money, by and large, isn't invested in creating new jobs in Britain. By and large, it's invested in buying houses in London, expensive flats in London. It's invested in, it goes into the equity markets, but not to invest in new businesses, but to pump up the share prices of existing businesses. So I think that when you stand back and look at all these massive capital inflows into Britain, they're not nearly as useful for the economy as we'd like them to be. In fact, I think there's clear evidence that they create property market bubbles in the southeast of England. They jack up equity prices on the markets here, and there's very little evidence that they actually have a positive outcome in terms of creating new jobs, new business, new research and development in the United Kingdom.
Okay, now what about, what can we do to actually take action against the tax havens, given that the politicians are sort of captured by the super rich and they aren't going to get their finger out?
Well, that's right. I think it's absolutely right to talk about politicians being captured in this country, and that applies across most of the parties. I think, first of all, it's helpful to recognise that there is a problem, and I think now people are recognising there's a problem, and it's a global problem. It affects most ordinary people across the world. I think it's important that we in Britain recognise that not only are most of us victims of this tax haven economy, but also that Britain is a major global problem because so many of the tax havens are so closely linked to Britain. You look across the tax havens of the world, and almost half of them have the Queen's head on their stamp, or fly some kind of union flag, or are closely associated with the Commonwealth. So Britain is clearly a major player here. And as I said earlier, Britain is also blocking international attempts, both by the European Union and by the United Nations and by the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, to close down on tax havens. So I think that what we all need to do is to start putting pressure upon our politicians. We need to write to our politicians, and we need to stand up to our politicians and say, what are you doing to tackle tax havens? We demand now that you take action, real action. None of it is difficult. It all involves simple measures to improve international cooperation between tax authorities and to improve the transparency of companies. None of it's rocket science. It can all be done very quickly. The British government has been blocking it for many years. We now must put pressure upon our politicians to take action.
Okay, given that, I mean, it's nice to know, to get a bit of a focus, but what specific measures would need to be taken to close down the tax haven economy?
Right. Well, the first measure, and this would have a dramatic effect upon the tax haven economy, would be to adopt what's called automatic information exchange. Now, this is quite simple, really. If I, resident here in England, if I opened a bank account in a tax haven, in a branch in a tax haven, the branch in the tax haven would have to automatically inform the authorities in the tax haven that I, resident in England, have opened that account, and the authorities in the tax haven would automatically have to share that information under treaty arrangements with HM Revenue and Customs here in Britain. And just having that information that I've got that bank account would be enough to trigger their awareness that I've got that account, and if I start evading and not declaring the income on that account, then they would know. But anyway, there would be a constant flow of information about the income being paid on that account. That would be quite enough to close down a lot of personal tax evasion in this country and around the world. And that's the standard which the European Union already operates, and which we're trying to have extended to cover all countries and all tax havens around the world. So that's one measure, and Britain should now stop blocking attempts by the European Union to implement that effectively, and if they did that, we'd very quickly cut back on a lot of tax evasion. Another measure would be to cut back on tax evasion and avoidance by multinational companies, simply by requiring them to adopt an international financial reporting standard to disclose their accounts for every country and every jurisdiction where they operate around the world. And that would help us to identify, and help tax authorities to identify where they're using tax havens to shift their profits out of the countries where they generate the profits into tax havens. Simple measures, nothing complicated about them, nothing very expensive about them, but this would do a great deal to improve international cooperation and tackle the tax havens.
Okay, John, the introduction to the second hour, I talked about a particular rather bizarre bit of news this week, that the Tetra Pak billionaire Ava Rousing, she kept much of her wealth offshore and as part of a cabin apartment which she'd bought on a cruise ship called The World. Now, this is a new one on me, the idea that you buy an apartment on a cruise ship and you can sort of hop in and hop out when you feel like it, but that is actually being used as a tax avoidance mechanism.
That's right. I mean, the world is a particularly bizarre thing, and I would encourage listeners to kind of Google the world and have a look at this extraordinary thing, which, from what I understand, is a really unpleasant place, because one of the sad things about very rich people is they're very selfish and self-absorbed. So you've got a huge collection of selfish and self-absorbed and rather greedy people on this ship, and from what I've heard, it's a really unpleasant atmosphere. In fact, that's been well covered in the Italian press. But I mean, in the case of Rousing, of course, that family, originally from Scandinavia, came to Britain, lived in London precisely because London is an offshore tax haven, and they have non-domiciled status here in Britain, which means they only pay tax on a very small proportion of their global income. As long as they keep their income outside England, they don't pay tax on it. And this is another part of tax haven Britain, which is why so many oligarchs from around the world move to London, because they're largely living here, taking advantage of all the fantastic facilities that we provide here in London and in England, but they're not paying tax towards it. And this is a very unsatisfactory part of Britain's tax haven status.
Finally, John, we hear this week that the BBC is having to defend the fact that it is paying its employees as companies, and that many of those companies are actually offshore and abroad, as well as civil servants. This is a sort of breaking story, I think, brought out by XRO News, the news agency in London, over the last few weeks. Do you think there may be some movement on that? Because it seems that some of our taxpayers' money is going straight, rather than people paying PAYE, is going straight into companies in tax havens, and this is being used as a tax avoidance measure.
Well, that's absolutely correct, and I hope that the government will now take strong measures. It is unacceptable for a public broadcasting organisation to pay its senior staff in this way. It's unacceptable for anyone, frankly, to use tax havens for tax avoidance. I know they always say, look, what we're doing is perfectly legal, but I think what ordinary people have to understand is the tax codes in this country, and in most countries, are largely shaped to meet the interests of tax avoiders and the people who use tax havens. They spend a lot of money lobbying government to have these loopholes built into the tax codes. And they moan all the time about how complex tax arrangements are, but they love that complexity, because the more complexity that there is, the more opportunity there is for their lawyers to identify loopholes and exploit them. So I hope the government is going to take very strong measures, that the BBC should take strong measures now to close this down entirely. There's a simple word for this. They like to say it's tax avoidance. I'm afraid it's cheating. It's cheating all ordinary people in this country, and it's time to close it down. But also, Tony, whilst we're talking about it, the issue has become very hot in America this week, because Vanity Fair, which is a hugely important magazine in America and around the world, has run a big story in this latest edition about how Mitt Romney, who's one of the candidates for the election opposing President Obama, has been using the Cayman Islands for his own affairs. And this story is pointing the spotlight on a presidential candidate in the United States, saying, well, what are you doing here? Why won't you disclose your tax affairs? Because is it right that a presidential candidate for the United States doesn't actually pay tax on his wealth in the United States? So this issue is becoming very, very hot, not only here in Britain, but also in the United States.
OK, watch this space. John Christensen from the Tax Justice Network, thanks ever so much for joining us on Drive Time this evening.